The day we stopped praying. We cried out to God. Every language, every dialect, every broken whisper and screamed plea, all of it rose into the sky like smoke from a burning world. Mosques, churches, temples, even men who hadn't believed in anything since childhood suddenly found themselves bargaining with the void. And the void answered. Just not the way we expected. The sky didn't split open with angels. It bled. Not metaphorically. Not poetically. It bled, a slow, spreading stain across the heavens, crimson veins cracking through blue like fractures in glass. Satellites went blind. Pilots screamed into dead radios. And then they arrived. No warning. No message. Just war. The first ships came down like falling gods, impossible shapes, angular and vast, blotting out sunlight. Cities didn't get destroyed. They got erased. Clean. Surgical. Gone. New York vanished in under 6 seconds. Delhi followed. Then Lagos. The broadcasts that survived didn't show explosions. Just light. Blinding, indifferent light. And when it faded, there was nothing left to mourn. That's when the prayers started. And that's when command finally spoke. Stop looking up, General Armin Hale said, his voice cutting through every remaining frequency on Earth. They're not listening. Hale wasn't a religious man. He didn't believe in miracles. He believed in contingencies. And Earth had one left. 3 days into the invasion, humanity had already lost. Not strategically. Not tactically. Existentially. The aliens, who would later be called the Karen Dominion, didn't invade like conquerors. They didn't occupy. They didn't negotiate. They culled. Their weapons didn't just kill, they rewrote matter. Entire regions were turned into glass plains, oceans boiled into toxic storms, and anything resembling resistance was crushed before it could organize. We threw everything at them. Nuclear weapons? Swatted out of the sky. EMP bursts? Useless. Cyber warfare? Laughable. It was like trying to stab a hurricane. And yet, they kept getting closer to something. Patterns began to emerge. Not in what they destroyed, but in what they didn't. Certain regions were avoided. Certain fault lines left untouched. Certain depths ignored. That's when Hale made the call that would either save humanity, or finish what the aliens started. Wake it up. Deep beneath the crust of the earth, far below where any human had the right to exist, there was a facility that officially didn't exist. No name. No flag. No oversight. Just a project. The men who built it had called it Project Edenfall. The men who inherited it called it something else. The coffin. Because whatever was inside was buried for a reason. Hale stood in the observation chamber, staring down through reinforced glass thicker than a city block. Below him, machinery the size of skyscrapers hummed to life, their ancient systems groaning like something waking from a long, unwilling sleep. Dr. Eliza Varn stood beside him, arms folded, eyes hollow from years of knowing too much. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. Hale didn't look at her. "We're past mistakes, Doctor. This is desperation. That thing down there isn't a weapon." "No," Hale replied. "It's worse." The lights flickered. Far below, something shifted. Not mechanically. Organically. A low, resonant sound rolled upward through the chamber. Not a roar, not a growl, but something deeper. Something aware. Varn's voice trembled. "We never controlled it. We barely contained it." Hale finally turned to her, his expression carved from stone. "Good," he said. "Because the last thing we need is something that listens to us." On the surface, the Karen Dominion began Phase 2. The broadcasts we intercepted weren't meant for us, but we heard them anyway. Cold. Calculated. Clinical. Biosphere degradation at acceptable levels. Indigenous resistance. Negligible. Commence planetary harvesting protocols. Harvesting. That word spread faster than fear. Because it meant one thing. They weren't here to wipe us out. They were here to use us. In a bunker beneath what used to be the Alps, a group of soldiers watched the live feed of a Karen ground unit for the first time. The creatures weren't humanoid. They were worse. Tall, segmented bodies encased in shifting armor that seemed to breathe. Limbs that didn't bend so much as flow. Faces, if they had them, were hidden behind translucent membranes pulsing with faint light. One of the soldiers muttered, "What the hell are those things?" Captain Rourke didn't answer immediately. He just kept watching as the alien unit moved through the ruins of a village, scanning, collecting, processing. "They're not soldiers," he finally said. "Then what?" Rourke's jaw tightened. "Farmers." Back in the coffin, the temperature dropped. Not gradually. Instantly. Frost crawled across steel surfaces, crystallizing in patterns that didn't follow any known physics. The air itself felt heavier, like it had weight. Varn stepped back, her breath visible now. "It's reacting." "To what?" Hale asked. She hesitated. Then, quietly, "To them." The first Karen ship entered low orbit above the facility an hour later. They hadn't noticed it before. Now they had. Which meant one thing. Whatever was buried beneath them had just made itself known. Sirens screamed. Defense systems activated. Missiles, railguns, everything humanity had left in one desperate cluster of defiance. It didn't matter. The ship fired once. Just once. And the mountain above the facility ceased to exist. Dust and debris rained down into the shattered remains of the coffin's upper levels. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, sealing off collapsing sections. Sparks lit the darkness like dying stars. Hale pulled himself from the floor, blood running down his temple. "Status," he barked. "Upper levels are gone," someone shouted back. "Containment chamber intact, for now." "For now." Hale snapped. Varn was already running toward the main console, fingers flying across cracked screens. "It's accelerating," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "Whatever state it was in before, it's gone. This is something else." Another tremor shook the facility. This one didn't come from above. It came from below. The Karen ship prepared a second strike. Its targeting systems locked onto the energy spike deep beneath the Earth's surface, an anomaly that didn't match any known biological or technological signature. For the first time since their arrival, the Dominion hesitated. A signal was sent. A question, translated loosely into human terms. "What is this?" No one on Earth answered. Because no one on Earth knew. Down in the depths, the coffin opened. Not with an explosion. Not with a breach. But with something far more unsettling. It simply unfolded. Layers of containment peeled back like petals, revealing a space that shouldn't exist, larger on the inside than the structure containing it, filled with a darkness that wasn't the absence of light, but the presence of something that devoured it. And in that darkness, something moved, not waking, not rising, but remembering. Hale stood at the edge of the observation platform, staring into the impossible void below. For the first time since the invasion began, he felt something that wasn't anger, wasn't fear. It was doubt. "What did we just unleash?" he whispered. Dr. Varn didn't answer right away. Because she was staring at the readings, at data that made no sense, at patterns that looked disturbingly like language. Finally she spoke. Her voice barely audible. "We didn't unleash it," she said. "We reminded it." On the surface, the Karen ship fired its second shot. But this time, the beam never reached the ground. It bent. Not deflected. Not blocked. Bent. Curving unnaturally as if reality itself had decided to change its mind. The beam arced upward, and struck the ship that fired it. Silence followed. Then, the sky screamed. All across Earth, every surviving screen, radio, and neural implant lit up with a signal. Not from the Karen. Not from any human source. Something else. Something older. The message wasn't in words, but everyone understood it. A single, overwhelming thought pressed into the minds of billions. "You called for help." A pause. Heavy. Ancient. patient. Then, "We heard you." General Hale closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to believe. Not in God. Not in salvation. But in something far more dangerous. Retribution. He opened his eyes again, staring into the abyss below. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what you can do." Far above, the Karen Dominion, masters of 1,000 conquered worlds, did something they had not done in centuries. They recalculated. Because for the first time since they arrived, Earth wasn't just a target anymore. It was a question, and they were no longer sure they wanted the answer. The thing that answered. The Karen Dominion did not feel fear. They had catalogued it, dissected it, weaponized it, but they did not experience it. Across 1,000 systems, they had broken species that worshipped stars, devoured civilizations that believed themselves eternal, and reduced entire biospheres to raw material without hesitation. Fear was inefficient. Fear was primitive. Fear was for prey. And yet, as the burning remains of their own vessel spiraled down through Earth's atmosphere, its hull warped inward as if crushed by an invisible hand, the Dominion encountered something they had no classification for. Uncertainty. Inside the surviving Karen fleet, calculations cascaded at impossible speeds. The anomaly defied modeling. Energy readings contradicted themselves. Spatial distortions registered, then unregistered, like reality itself was stuttering. And at the center of it all, that signal. Not a transmission. Not electromagnetic, not quantum. It was intrusive. It bypassed their systems. It bypassed their shielding. It spoke directly into their cognition. "You called for help." The phrase repeated, not as sound, but as meaning. And for the first time in centuries, the Dominion's central intelligence, an entity composed of millions of linked consciousness nodes, paused. Then, cautiously, it responded. Not with words. With intent. Identify. Deep beneath the earth, the thing that had been sleeping considered the question. Not in language. Not in time. It did not think the way humans did. It did not process the way the Karen did. It simply was. Ancient beyond measurement. Patient beyond comprehension. And now, interrupted, the darkness within the opened coffin pulsed, not outward, but inward, like something drawing breath after an eternity of suffocation. Dr. Eliza Varnes stared at the monitors, her hands trembling as data flooded in, then corrupted itself, then reformed into patterns that almost made sense. "It's communicating," she whispered. Hale's voice was tight. "With them?" Varnes shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "With everything." On the surface, the war changed. It didn't escalate. It shifted. The Karen deployed ground units to secure the anomaly site, descending in perfect formation, silent, efficient, unstoppable. Or at least, they had been. The first unit to touch down near the impact zone didn't die. It unraveled. Its form didn't explode or collapse. It simply lost cohesion, its segmented body dissolving into fine particulate matter that hung in the air for a moment before being pulled downward. Not by gravity. By something else. The second unit fired. Its weapon, a focused beam capable of slicing through reinforced planetary crust, struck the ground. Nothing happened. No impact. No effect. It was as if the beam had never existed. The third unit didn't fire. It turned. And ran. In the bunker, Captain Rourke watched the feed, his knuckles white around the edge of the console. "Tell me I'm seeing this wrong," one of his men muttered. Rourke didn't answer. Because there was nothing to say. They had spent days watching humanity get dismantled like a broken machine. Now, something else was dismantling the dismantlers. And it wasn't using weapons. Back in the depths, the coffin continued to unfold. Structures that had taken decades to build peeled away like they were made of paper. Containment fields flickered, then inverted, their energy flowing into the void instead of holding it back. Hale staggered as another tremor rolled through the chamber. "How much longer until we lose control?" he demanded. Varn let out a hollow laugh. General, we never had control. The darkness below shifted again. And this time, it looked back. Not with eyes. Not with any physical feature. But with awareness so vast it made the human mind recoil. Hale felt it. For a fraction of a second, his thoughts weren't entirely his own. Memories surfaced. Childhood, war, loss, then were gone, sifted through like pages in a book. Evaluated. Judged. And then, dismissed. He dropped to one knee, gasping. What is it doing?" he choked. Varn's voice was barely steady. "It's learning," she said. High above, the Karen fleet made a decision. They had encountered anomalies before. They had neutralized them, contained them, exploited them. This would be no different. It couldn't be. The command spread instantly through the fleet. Escalate. Dozens of ships repositioned, their weapons charging in unison. The energy required for what came next would have sterilized a continent. They didn't care. Earth was no longer a resource. It was a risk. And risks were eliminated. General Hale saw the readings spike. His blood ran cold. "They're going to burn the planet," he said. Varn didn't look away from the abyss. "No," she whispered. "They're going to try." The first volley fired. A lattice of pure annihilation energy lanced down from orbit, converging on a single point, the open wound in the earth where the coffin had been. For a moment it looked like the end, like the inevitable conclusion to a war humanity had never had a chance of winning. And then, the world paused. Not literally. Time still moved. Hearts still beat. But something fundamental shifted. Like a breath being held. The beams slowed. Not in speed. In meaning. Their purpose, destruction, seemed to lose coherence. They flickered. Wavered. And then, they stopped. Suspended in midair like threads of light caught in an invisible web. Every human watching, every soldier, every survivor, felt it. That presence again. Closer now. Heavier. No. The word didn't echo. It settled. Like a law being written into the fabric of reality. And the beams vanished. Silence. Total. Absolute. Then, slowly, the ground began to rise. Not from tectonic movement. Not from pressure. From will. The shattered remains of the mountain lifted, debris floating upward as if gravity had simply lost interest. Dust hung in the air, unmoving, as the earth itself reshaped around the opening. Something was coming out. Not climbing. Not emerging. Just becoming visible. The Karen fleet registered the event. For the first time in their recorded history, they attempted to retreat. Engines flared. Coordinates shifted. But space around them didn't agree. Distances stretched. Vectors bent. Ships that should have moved remained exactly where they were, their motion trapped in a loop of impossible geometry. Panic, not emotion but systemic instability, rippled through the Dominion's network. This wasn't resistance. This wasn't warfare. This was dominance. Down below, the thing that had been buried under Earth for longer than humanity had existed finally revealed a fraction of itself. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a machine. It was something that made those categories feel childish. A vast, shifting mass of darkness and light, its form never settling, its edges bleeding into dimensions the human eye couldn't process. Looking at it directly hurt. Understanding it was worse. Dr. Varn fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "It's not from here," she whispered. Hale, still struggling to stand, shook his head. "No," he said hoarsely. "It is here." The presence turned its attention upward, toward the Karen fleet, toward the ones who had come to harvest, to erase, to conquer. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then, the message came again. But this time, it wasn't for humanity. It was for them. "You take." A pause. Not hesitation. Judgment. "Now you give." The first Karen ship didn't explode. It inverted. Its structure folded inward, collapsing into a point so small it ceased to exist. Not destroyed, but removed. The second ship followed. Then the third. No weapons. No resistance. Just erasure. One by one, the fleet began to disappear, each vessel reduced to nothing by a force that didn't attack. It corrected. On the surface, humanity watched. Some cheered. Some cried. Some simply stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Captain Rourke leaned back in his chair, a slow, disbelieving grin spreading across his face. "Remind me," he said to no one in particular, "to never piss off this planet again." But deep in the coffin, Dr. Varn wasn't smiling. She was staring at the data, at the patterns still forming, still evolving, at the way the presence interacted with reality itself, and at one terrifying detail that no one else seemed to notice. "It's not stopping," she said softly. Hale looked at her, his expression hardening. "What do you mean?" Varn swallowed. "It's not just targeting them," she said. "It's balancing something." "Balancing what?" She hesitated. Because the answer didn't make sense. Because the answer was impossible. And because the answer meant that humanity's salvation might also be its judgment. Finally she spoke. "Everything. The price of being saved." At first, humanity celebrated. How could we not? The sky, once a graveyard of falling cities and silent prayers, had become a battlefield where something else, something ours, was winning. The Karen Dominion, conquerors of worlds, were vanishing. Not retreating. Not surrendering. Ending. Across every surviving screen, their ships collapsed into nothing. No explosions, no debris, just absence. Entire formations erased like mistakes in a calculation. People cheered in bunkers. They wept in ruined streets. They laughed in that wild, broken way only survivors understand. "We did it," someone whispered into a live mic that reached half the planet. "We actually did it." General Hale heard it. And for the first time since the invasion began. He didn't respond. Because Hale was watching something else. Not the sky. The numbers. Casualty projections had stopped rising. Then they started again. Slowly. Subtly. But undeniably. He turned to Dr. Varn, his voice low. "Tell me I'm wrong." She didn't look at him. "About what?" Hale swallowed. "Our losses," he said. "They're still increasing." Silence stretched between them. Then Varn exhaled, like someone finally giving up on a lie. "It's not targeting humanity," she said carefully. "But it's not targeting us either." The presence beneath the earth didn't think in terms of allies or enemies. It didn't recognize species. It didn't understand war. What it perceived was imbalance. And imbalance required correction. In the ruins of what had once been Sao Paulo, a group of survivors watched as the sky above them twisted. Not violently. Not destructively. Just wrong. One man pointed upward, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" At first, it looked like a mirage, a ripple in the air, bending light at impossible angles. Then the ground beneath their feet cracked. Not from force. From absence. A section of the city, 3 blocks wide, simply disappeared. Buildings. People. Sound. Gone. No explosion. No warning. Just a clean, surgical removal. Like it had never been there at all. Captain Rourke stared at the new feed, the grin from earlier long gone. "Okay," he muttered. "I take it back." No one laughed. Because it wasn't an isolated incident. Reports flooded in from across the globe. Random. Unpredictable. Terrifyingly precise. Entire areas. Sometimes populated, sometimes not, were being adjusted. Not destroyed. Not attacked. Edited. Back in the coffin, Varn's hands flew across the console, pulling in data from every surviving satellite, every ground sensor, every fragment of humanity's shattered infrastructure. "It's mapping us," she said. Hale's jaw tightened. "For what?" Varn hesitated. Then she brought up a projection. At first glance, it looked like noise, points of light scattered across a dark sphere. Then the pattern emerged. Clusters, densities, gap. It's not random, she said. It's calculating distribution. Resources. Massachusetts energy. Hale cut her off. In English, doctor. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It's deciding how much of us should exist. Far above, the last of the Karen fleet made a desperate move. Their central intelligence, fractured, collapsing under the weight of something it could not process, initiated a protocol older than most of the civilizations they had destroyed. Not retreat, not attack, appeal. A signal was broadcast directly into the anomaly. Not a demand, not a threat, a plea. We withdraw. We cease harvesting. This world is yours. For a moment, the presence paused, and for the first time since it had awakened, it responded with something resembling curiosity. Yours. The concept didn't fit. Ownership, territory, dominion. These were constructs of lesser minds, temporary arrangements in a universe governed by deeper laws. Still, it considered. Then, you misunderstand. The last Karen ship vanished. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, stretched across a fraction of a second that felt like eternity, its form unraveling, its existence reduced to nothing more than a memory, and then not even that. The Dominion was gone. Completely. Irrevocably. Humanity had won. And that's when the real horror began. General Hale watched the final readings come in. No more enemy signals. No more incoming fire. No more war. Just the presence. Still there. Still active. Still working. He turned to Varn. How do we stop it? She didn't answer. Because she didn't have one. Because you don't stop something that isn't attacking. You don't fight something that isn't fighting. And you don't negotiate with something that doesn't recognize you as something worth negotiating with. It's not a weapon, she said finally. Hale's voice was sharp. Then what is it? Varn looked at him, her eyes hollow. It's a system, she said. And we just triggered it. Across the world, the adjustments continued. A coastal region in Japan vanished. A desert in Africa expanded, swallowing entire settlements in seconds. A frozen stretch of Siberia bloomed into forest, life erupting where none had existed for centuries. It wasn't random. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. Balance restored. Excess removed. Deficiency corrected. Humanity wasn't being punished. It was being accounted for. And then, the message changed. Not in tone. In direction. For the first time since it had spoken, it addressed humanity directly. Not as a collective. Not as a species. But as individuals. Billions of minds, touched simultaneously by something that did not understand individuality, yet tried anyway. You called. The words settled into every consciousness, heavy with something that almost felt like expectation. You were heard. A pause. Then, define enough. Panic spread faster than any invasion ever could. What does that mean? Enough of what? Population. Resources. Us. Governments, what remained of them, tried to respond. Scientists scrambled for models. Religious leaders declared it judgment, salvation, apocalypse, all at once. And in the middle of it all, General Hale made a decision. We answer it, he said. Varn stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You can't be serious. We asked for help, Hale replied. Now it's asking for parameters. That's not how this works. Varn snapped. You don't negotiate with something like that. Hale's expression hardened. We already did, he said. The moment we woke it up. The problem wasn't how to respond. It was who gets to decide. Enough of what? War? Suffering? Humanity itself? Every answer carried a cost. Every choice meant deciding who lived and who didn't. Hale knew that. He'd spent his entire career making those kinds of decisions, but never on this scale. In the end, the answer didn't come from a government, or a council, or a scientist. It came from somewhere far simpler, far more human. A single voice, broadcast across every channel that still functioned. Not a politician, not a general, just a man. Old, tired, and very, very done with watching the world burn. "We don't know what you are," the man said, his voice steady despite everything. "We don't know what you want." A pause. Then, "But we know what we don't want." Silence fell across the planet. Even the presence seemed to listen. "We don't want to be wiped out," the man continued. "We don't want to be balanced into extinction. We don't want to lose what little we have left." His voice cracked just slightly. "But we also don't want to be what we were." That hit harder than anything else, because everyone knew what that meant. War, greed, destruction. The same things that had made the Karen see Earth as just another resource to harvest. "We'll fix it," the man said. "Or at least, we'll try." A long, heavy breath. "Just give us the chance to be enough." For a moment, nothing happened. No response. No adjustment. No sign that the message had even been received. Hale clenched his fist. Varn held her breath. The entire world waited. Then, the presence answered. Not immediately. Not clearly. But undeniably. Attempt acknowledged. A pause. Longer this time. Heavier. Observation, ongoing. The adjustments slowed. Not stopped. But slowed. The removals became less frequent. Less severe. As if something was watching. Learning. Waiting. General Hale let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We bought ourselves time," he said. Varn didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. "Time for what?" she asked. Hale didn't have an answer. Because deep down, he knew the truth. They hadn't defeated the enemy. They hadn't saved the world. They had done something far more dangerous. They had convinced something beyond comprehension. To judge them slowly. And that meant one thing. The war wasn't over. It had just changed sides. The day we became worth keeping. The war didn't end. It quieted. That was somehow worse. No sirens. No fire raining from the sky. No alien fleets blotting out the sun. Just a strange, suffocating stillness, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to decide if it deserved the next one. And above all of it, that presence. Watching. Always watching. Weeks passed. Then months. Humanity adapted the only way it knew how. Poorly, stubbornly, and just enough to survive. Cities didn't rebuild the way they used to. No sprawling skylines, no endless expansion. Structures became smaller, tighter, efficient. Waste dropped. Not because of policy, but because entire regions that exceeded acceptable thresholds simply stopped existing. You learned fast when the consequence wasn't fines or politics. It was erasure. Governments tried to reassert control. Some succeeded. Most didn't. Because control required power, and power, it turned out, didn't belong to humanity anymore. It belonged to the thing beneath their feet. General Hale stood on what used to be a mountain ridge, staring out over a landscape that had been corrected. The air was cleaner. The forests denser. The rivers clearer than they'd been in a century. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. Beside him, Dr. Varn adjusted a portable sensor array, her expression as grim as ever. "It's stabilizing," she said. Hale glanced at her. "Define stabilizing." She hesitated. Then, "The rate of adjustments is decreasing. Patterns are becoming more predictable." "That sounds like good news." "It would be," Varn replied, "if we were part of the pattern." They weren't. Not really. Humanity wasn't being guided. It wasn't being protected. It was being evaluated. Like a variable in an equation too large to comprehend. The first real test came without warning. It always did. In what remained of the North Atlantic, a coalition fleet gathered, humanity's last attempt at asserting something resembling control over its own destiny. Warships from a dozen nations, retrofitted with whatever technology still worked, formed a defensive perimeter around a cluster of offshore platforms. Energy production, resource management, a step toward independence, or at least the illusion of it. Admiral Sorensen stood on the bridge of the flagship, staring at the readouts. No anomalies detected, her XO reported. Keep scanning, she replied. It's never no anomalies. It's just not yet. She wasn't wrong. It started with the water. The ocean beneath the fleet went still. Not calm. Still. Waves froze mid-motion, suspended like glass sculptures. The wind died instantly, sails slackening, radar clutter vanishing into perfect silence. Every system on every ship flickered. Then, the message came. Not to the world. Not to the masses. To them. The ones testing the boundaries. Define necessity. Sorensen closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Then she opened them again, jaw set. All right, she muttered. Round 2. Back in the coffin, what remained of it? Varn's instruments spiked. It's focusing, she said. On what? Hale asked. On us, she replied. Specifically, on decisions. Hale frowned. What decisions? Varn pulled up a live feed. The fleet. The platforms. The fragile, desperate attempt at reclaiming something of their world. It's asking why we need this, she said. Hale's expression darkened. Because we do, he said. That should be enough. Varn shook her head. For us maybe, she said. Not for it. Out on the ocean, Sorensen stepped forward, as if the thing beneath reality itself could somehow see her better that way. We need power, she said, her voice steady as it broadcast across every channel. To survive. To rebuild. To maintain what's left. Silence. Then. Survival exceeds current parameters. Sorensen's grip tightened on the console. Then update your parameters, she snapped. A dangerous thing to say to something that could erase continents. But she said it anyway. Because that's what humans did. We pushed. Even when we shouldn't. For a long moment. Nothing. Then the ocean moved again. Not violently. Not aggressively. But with purpose. The platforms beneath the fleet began to sink. Slowly. Deliberately. Not destroyed. Removed. Sorensen felt the shift immediately. Hold position, she barked. But the ships weren't responding. Not because of malfunction. Because the concept of holding position had just stopped applying. Back on the ridge, Hale watched the feed, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. It's rejecting us, he said. Varn didn't respond right away. She was staring at something else. At the deeper data. At the patterns beneath the patterns. No, she said finally. It's testing us. The platforms sank halfway. Then stopped. Suspended between existence and absence. Waiting. Sorensen took a slow breath. Then another. And then. She laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. But because she finally understood. You don't care if we live, she said, looking out over the impossible stillness. Another pause. Then. Incorrect. Sorensen's smile faded. Then what do you care about? She demanded. This time. The answer came without hesitation. Balance. Back in the coffin, Varn's eyes widened. That's it, she whispered. Hale turned to her. What? It's not choosing between us and the planet, she said. It's choosing both. Hale frowned. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to, Varn replied. It's not human. Out on the ocean, Sorensen straightened. Then listen carefully, she said. Her voice carried. Not through speakers, not through radios, but through something deeper. We're part of that balance, she said. Flawed, destructive, stubborn, but part of it. The water beneath her feet rippled. Just slightly. We're not asking to take everything, she continued. We're asking to belong. Silence. Heavy. Endless. Then. The platforms moved. Not down. Rising slowly back to the surface. Stabilizing. Remaining. Across the world, similar moments unfolded. Not all successful, not all clean, but different. Humanity wasn't being erased. It was being negotiated with. Not in words, in actions, in consequences, in choices. Months turned into a year. Then two. The presence never left, never slept, never stopped watching. But it changed. Subtly, gradually, as humanity did. We learned. Slowly, painfully, but we learned. Not because we were told to, because we had to, because every excess had a cost, every imbalance a consequence, and every time we got it wrong, something reminded us. General Hale didn't live to see the end of it. Few of the old world's leaders did. War has a way of taking its due, even after it's over. But before he died, he stood once more at the edge of the coffin, looking down into the impossible darkness that had saved, and nearly ended, his species. Varn stood beside him, older now, quieter. "Do you think we made the right call?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Because it wasn't a simple question. Finally, she said, "I think we made the only call we had left." Hale nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds about right." He looked down one last time. "Hey," he muttered, half to himself, half to the thing below. "Thanks, I guess." For a long time, nothing. Then, just as he turned to leave, a thought brushed against his mind. Faint, almost gentle. "You adapt." A pause. Then, "You remain." Years later, humanity would tell the story differently. They'd call it a miracle, a second chance. Some would even call it divine. But the truth, the real truth, was far stranger. We cried out to God, and something answered. Not a savior, not a destroyer, but something far more terrifying. A keeper of balance, a force that didn't care about our hopes, our dreams, or our fears, only that we didn't tip the scales too far. And in the end, that was enough, because for the first time in our history, humanity wasn't fighting to conquer, or to survive. We were fighting to be worth keeping.